Hello, good morning and welcome. This is Cheche, the show where opinion counts, live on Citizen TV. I'm your host, Udwaka Mimo. Now, the repercussions of the 4-day Westgate Mall siege are still playing out, with President Uhuru Kenyatta announcing a commission of inquiry into the response. And so on Cheche today, we have our own mini inquiry into the lapses as well as the lessons we can learn from the Westgate attack. We're doing that with first a former director of military intelligence with the Kenya Defence Forces, retired Major General Charles Manzia. He now lectures at the Catholic University. We also have with us Michael Mayer, Dean of the New Graduate School of Media and Communications at the Aga Khan University. He's a former communications director for the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Also in the Cheche studio, Waweru Mburu of Royal Media Services, sitting in for Mutegi Njau, who's on leave, as well as political commentator David Makali. They will be our panel for today. So, Major General Manzia, I'll start with you first, because of course the military aspect of this operation was quite evident. What do you see as the most obvious lapse as we review the Westgate Mall attack?
Well, to begin with, I see the operation as having been successful. And the military were called upon, I would say the last minute without much warning because of the nature of the terrorist attack which happened at the Westgate. The major lapse, I would say, does not lie in the operation itself, but probably the intelligence and the response by the various security agencies towards the threat.
Much has been said about that. So what exactly do you mean? Where was the lapse? Because we've heard about government agencies and government officials being warned about the attack beforehand. So where do you see the lapse, being as you were a former military intelligence officer?
What I see is that most probably there was, the information was there, but like it has always happened previously, overwhelming information which may not have been actionable information or intelligence, because when you get the information, traditionally in the intelligence, it goes through a process of an analysis. Then once you mount the picture, it makes, you get, but the information you get once it's analyzed, and once it is analyzed, and then it has to be actionable intelligence for the various responsible individuals within the government to be able to act. And actionable intelligence is always acted upon.
What do you mean by actionable intelligence? Why wasn't this the fact that we were told that Israeli targets were soft targets and likely to be attacked, that we were given a window frame for these attacks? Why was that not actionable?
I'm not quite sure whether, talking about actionable intelligence, I mean an intelligence that's got time bound. You know exactly what is going to happen and where, when and how it is going to happen, and then you can be able to act on that.
From what we're seeing, though, that happened.
Let me tell you that the various targets within the country which have been mentioned, I've heard of those same targets many, many times, many years ago. And the information has always been coming. And it never gave any time limit to whatever. And you've seen, they had the security, but it may not have been sufficient security to be able to mitigate the threat.
I just wanted to ask, obviously the different agencies that collect intelligence, you served in the military intelligence. Would you ordinarily share your intelligence with the National Intelligence Security or the CID intelligence? Is there coordination or sharing of intelligence?
What they call the the security intelligence machinery actually share intelligence all the time. There are frequent meetings. They are from the military, from national intelligence, and then at the strategic level, there are frequent meetings where the Chief of Defense Force, the Inspector General, and all other heads of other agencies meet. They meet very, very frequently. They communicate a lot, and I think there's absolutely, at that level, that strategic level, you cannot talk of any lapse of any kind, because they meet, they share intelligence, and they are briefed accordingly, very, very frequently.
And then whichever arm of the security agencies is tasked to respond to certain threats, usually this would be, I mean, the military, let's say, you know, your background, the military would not regularly be intervening in some of those threats. They would be outside the military. Would that be a correct analysis?
I think you are correct. For internal incidents, I would say the military is only called upon to assist the civil power, to be able to assist the civil authority. They are called upon, and usually the police have, you know, they always within the, you know, in the internal setup, the police always take the leading role, and then the military comes in support. And this has always happened, I would say, since independence. I don't think much has changed in the country.
In 2001, the Al-Shabaab warned Kenya that we have high-rise buildings and businesses, and that their people are suffering, and they are going to bring down our buildings. 2 to 3 years after that warning, we are seeing buildings starting to come down. How would we say there are no lapses when in reality, actually, these guys are getting us?
The kind of information that they are going to bring buildings down, I can say that, you know, it's a very unrealistic threat, because one, how many buildings do we have in the city, and which are high rise, and would you deploy the entire forces, government forces in the buildings? It is not possible, but the threats are usually on the extreme. It is true that they would definitely, they came to Westgate. They are likely to be able to target other areas, but it was not possible to be able to...
Even though we were told that they were targeting Israeli-owned buildings and businesses.
That has been a traditional nature of Al-Qaeda and most other terrorist groups.
I suppose the point is that it makes it easier for us to guard those installations. But we'll pause for a minute and come to Michael Meyer, because of course you're a communications professional. From your vantage point, from where you sit, we'll come to the lessons in a minute, but what did you observe? What did you think was the most obvious lapse?
Well, in any crisis, there are two elements of your response. The first and most important by far is your security response. And in this I have to agree with General Manzia. Even the Israelis did not have actionable specific intelligence concerning threats. They issued a general threat to Israeli citizens saying that during the period of Rosh Hashanah, from early September through the end of the month, they would be on a heightened state of alert. They should expect some sort of attack, or should be prepared for some sort of attack. But that's not actionable intelligence. This is the kind of warning that's routinely issued, whether by the Israeli embassy, the American State Department, or European embassies. On the second element of the response is public information. Now, the effectiveness of that response bordered almost on the inexcusable. From the very beginning, the first day of the crisis, the news was dominated by a comment by, I think, the police chief. Oh, he said, and quoted in all the newspapers and all the TV stations, oh, this seems to be a routine robbery. Now, please, a routine robbery with black-dressed terrorists barging into several entrances of a major shopping mall with automatic rifles, heavy shooting throughout a building, and for 24 hours almost, this is a routine robbery. The problem with this is it could be an innocent mistake. It could be just bad information, and in the heat of crisis, when you're dealing with so many other variables, you're not really thinking about what you might have said an hour, 2 hours, 4 hours ago. The problem is that what you said an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours ago dominates the news cycle because journalists are starving for information. So everyone picks up the same stuff, whether it's accurate or not. And from the beginning, the inability to control your message, to say what's actually happening, fact-based messaging, contaminated the authorities' response thereafter. And here we are today in a situation where the public questions almost everything that's out there. Who's responsible for the cave-in of the roof in the mall? Was that because the terrorists burned mattresses, or is that because the military fired rocket-propelled grenades or a more powerful explosive device and took out some pillars that caused the roof to collapse? How many terrorists were actually killed, if any? Were any captured? There are all these questions that we don't get satisfactory answers to. It's not that we need an answer per se, but what the public wants is a straightforward, direct grappling with the questions with clear answers. We know this, we don't know that. Because otherwise, conspiracy theories take over and you have a situation, a public reaction that's out of control.
As a communication expert, what comment do you have about the media response to this particular incident?
Well, I'm actually very impressed with, for the most part, the media response. I've been meeting with editors for the major newspapers over the past week. I know that some stories came out that were relatively lurid, very, very difficult to confirm to confirm these stories or not. I know that, say, the Nation Group, for example, would withhold stories that were quite compelling and later turned out to be true simply because they didn't feel they had fully confirmed them. But again, going back to my earlier point about crisis communications, if the authorities do not control the message, if they are not relatively direct and straightforward from the get-go, if they try to spin too hard, they lose trust. And once you've lost the public's trust on an issue, you don't get it back. And so that's the biggest challenge for the government right now.
In communication, crisis communication, you just say the IG made a rather, ridiculous claim, a statement that this was, normal routine thuggery. If after he realized that wasn't the case and these were terrorists, should he have revised that statement and said, look, at every point as you progress, you realize you were wrong, you correct that and say, actually, the position is this, the position is this. Is that doable? Or again?
It's very doable, and you do it by being simply acknowledging the element of human mistake that is always present in a crisis. It would be a relatively easy matter for the police chief or a public spokesman to go out and say, based on the information we have at present, this no longer looks like a robbery that we initially thought it might be. It's clearly a terrorist act. And you simply revise the record like that. Mm. The best response, public response in any situation, whether it's for a private company, a government, a journalistic institution, it's fact-based response.
Yes. But
because facts catch up with you. Facts always catch up with you.
I'm a bit surprised that you have such complimentary about remarks about how the media covered it. You think they held back some stories they couldn't confirm and so forth. But
in some cases,
yes. Would you say? I mean, was the media asking the right questions, or was the government not just volunteering? I mean, who was failing? Is it the media that was failing in prodding so that they get the right answers, or was it the government that was failing in communicating properly?
Well, we're mixing apples and oranges here.
Yeah.
The media, it's not a monolithic block. What the media is 1,000 hungry journalists who aren't getting enough information. Their editors are clamoring for news stories. They come from every quarter of the globe. This was one of the biggest stories in the world, and they weren't getting enough. So some journalists were asking responsible questions, some were asking the right questions, others were not, but they were legitimate questions. There were questions about how many people were injured, how many people were trapped in the mall. Was it correct for the authorities to turn people who were simply in the mall to call them hostages? We still don't know how many bona fide hostages there were. In terms of the government response, though, the government has a focus. The government is the government. There should be a designated crisis spokesman in these situations who goes on air and tells all these journalists clamoring for answers what we know to the best of our ability at this present moment, with all the due caveats. It's very easy to say, we don't know. Here's what we do know, here's what we don't know. As soon as we get answers to these basic questions, we will come forward.
But wasn't part of the challenge that we saw different people speaking, and at some point they weren't necessarily saying the same thing, to the extent that by the time the Inspector General of Police had acknowledged that this was terrorism, we then had the government spokesman declining to call them terrorists because he wasn't quite sure whether they were terrorists. And then we had the Interior Minister also speaking. And we saw later on, as the siege continued, we would see, colleagues whispering things to him during press conferences. So it just seems as though by the end of day one, when you'd expect that there would be some sort of realization of the gravity of what we were dealing with, there'd be some sort of concerted communication plan, which we never actually saw.
Well, I think you're absolutely point on. I'm only guessing based on what we all saw from the outside looking in. And in a crisis, you have to forgive governments for some mistakes. This is a very human enterprise. It's chaotic. It's high pressure. Mistakes get made. People are doing all these different things within the realm of their responsibility. It's very difficult to coordinate. But it seems clear to me that the government was surprised by this. Whether they should have been surprised or not is another question. But they were surprised. They were caught unawares. They clearly did not have procedures set up for dealing with a crisis of this magnitude. Now, I think they should have, because although the general is absolutely correct to say there was no actionable intelligence saying this attack will come within this interval, there certainly was ample evidence that sooner or later, at some point, something like this was going to happen. Well, what you do in cases like this is you set up procedures beforehand. Now, I'd like to hear the general comment on this. From my conversations with people who have received security briefings at the most senior level, the security response could have been better coordinated as well. I've heard that diplomatic police were scattered around the country, partly in the name of devolution, in order to protect the new bigwigs around in the counties. The election and the change of administrations scrambled a bit senior management in the security ranks. And so no one quite knew who was supposed to do what, under what circumstances. And as I say, I'm an outsider looking in, and I'd love to hear an insider looking out.
Yeah, to what extent is that true?
I think from what I know from my experience is that there's always a rapid response capability with the military and all the security agencies. And this, the rapid response capability is usually organized in such a way that each and every service of police, GSU, and all the security agencies, all of them know exactly what they are supposed to do exactly if something happened. And what they await is orders. And when they await for orders to be able to react, it is actually not right to assume that they are not organized in a way. They are usually organized and ready to respond to any crisis of any nature.
Okay, so let's go back to something you said earlier. You talked about the military being called on by, civilian agencies. So KDF moving into Westgate, at what point would that have become necessary? Because we do hear that there was a bit of resentment that the KDF were encroaching on the turf of the police. Why would it have been necessary to ask the military to come in?
Usually the response comes from the civil authority.
Right.
When you talk about civil authority, it means the minister. And the commander on the ground, the police must be able to request, not direct from the military, but he must notify the authorities that he has a problem, he needs this kind of support. But this it looked like it happened spontaneously in a way that as they moved...
You didn't go through the processes.
As the police moved in to the site, the military was also on the way, and they arrived at the scene, and it is not clear exactly how it was...
General Mwanzia,
Sure.
I think the question here is, we have lost over 60 people. So far, we have lost like 6 military officers.
8 now.
8 now. Yet we even don't know how many terrorists are dead or alive.
And we haven't seen their bodies.
And we haven't seen their bodies.
Even though we're told that one died in hospital.
Yeah, I must confess, since I'm not with the military anymore, that information, I've just, like you, and I'm not aware exactly
But
what
we're reviewing
transpired.
this. And so I remember speaking to you earlier, and you did say that it was odd that we hadn't, that a government would be, in a hurry to show its success. Given the diminishing public trust, would that not have been a quick win to display a body and say, we killed this terrorist?
Well, it is true that the government would want to show the successes. And one thing is that the modern militaries have got to show, the accountability to the citizens. In the democratization process of modern times, the military has been put to account for its actions world over. And it is clear that the questions which the press and the media were grappling with, the government is still in the process. And there were victims, relatives who are talking about missing relatives, but the Inspector General invited yesterday all those to come up.
I understand, General Mwanzia.
I have a big problem with what...
Do you know, we're going to have to pause so that we can get into the problem without having to interrupt it. This is Cheche, live on Citizen TV. We're looking at the lapses and lessons we can learn from the Westgate Mall siege with our guests, retired Major General Charles Mwanzia, a former Director of Military Intelligence, as well as Michael Mayer, Dean of the New Graduate School of Media and Communications at the Aga Khan University. If you've got any questions or opinions for them, the SMS number is 22422 and the Twitter handle is Cheche_TV.